I'd like to call to order the October meeting of the Morrisville Planning and Zoning Board. Sanjay to deliver an invocation.
As we gather today, we seek guidance and wisdom to engage in meaningful discussions to further the betterment of our community. Bless us with clear insight and impartial judgment as we consider the merits and pitfalls of each matter placed in front of us. We thank our first responder and all those who serve to keep all of us safe. We also thank Courtney for her service and wish her all the best in her future endeavors. Bless all of us with peace, love, good health, and happiness. Thank you.
So this evening, Chris will be our voting member because Lee Langston is not. So have you had a chance to look at the agenda for the September meeting? Any comments or questions or changes? And a motion to approve the minutes from last month? Second?
Second.
Second to approve the minutes. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
So we're going to go to item 6, which is opportunity for any members of the public who wish to speak on any. Then we'll move quickly ahead to item.
Good evening. This evening we are going to present a draft version of the Affordable Housing Plan. This really represents months of work that started earlier in May that really kind of began with, the major question of, do we have an affordable housing issue here in Morrisville? And if we do, what could we potentially do to address it? And that's really the heart of what this plan is about. I am going to turn it over to Charles Buki with CZB. He is the firm that helped to prepare the plan, he as well as some of his team. Turn it over to him for his presentation. And after the presentation, do you prefer they hold questions or ask as we go along?
Whatever works for the board members.
Chairman, do you have a preference?
I think we have an active board. They will probably ask questions when they feel like asking them.
Then we can definitely go that direction with it as well. On that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over then, and we'll start the presentation.
Can everybody hear me all right?
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We met a few weeks ago when we had a joint session with Town Council. So we've got a few brief slides. I believe in your packet you will have a draft of the early document that we had prepared. You may or may not have had an opportunity to go through it. In any case, the slides are a mirror image of some key excerpts. What I've tried to do here is keep this at a fairly high level to allow you to ask any questions you want, and gives you the opportunity to go as deep as you need to go. If there's any question I can't specifically answer, and I don't have Pete or Eric or Karen with me, I promise I'll get an answer for you right away. So it's about a dozen slides. I'll walk through the region at that level, then we'll take it down to Morrisville, and then we'll move it from there, following the same course that the draft has, to some recommendations, okay? All right. So first is, you will see up there a regional context, a regional map, and I want to encourage you to be skeptical of future housing studies, reports, analyses you see in the Herald, you see in the News and Observer, wherever you see a study, and it's a study of a small geography. Be somewhat skeptical of it, just as a way to understand the issue if it's not really contextualized. All right, the contemporary housing markets in 2020, have massive amounts of migration going in every direction on all hours of the day by two-income households, and it's a very complicated regional contextual setting and environment in which any local market finds itself. So that's where we started. What we have here is the region we've articulated as the Durham-Chapel Hill MSA and the Raleigh MSA. Those were the two that made the most sense to really understand what's happening in and around the triangle. Right? So the document makes that fairly clear. It's worth noting Morrisville's kind of like, from our point of view, a grand switching station. 90% of the folks who work here don't live here, and vice versa. So you've got lots and lots of coming and going, and as a consequence, the regional supply is really reacting to regional demand on a 2 MSA basis. Okay. So here we really get into this question of the extent to which you do, as Courtney had initiated, how do you think about this issue of affordable housing? So we would remind you it's a complex issue. It's an elastic market. Supply and demand are they're dynamic, and they're constantly relating to one another. In this slide, what's important here is that across the region, your incomes are so high that they can afford a $255,000 home. Now, these are at high level, okay? So we're blending owner households and renter households, but that's their purchasing power. The median price point is $218,600, so there's a big gap there, okay? You would see these bars reversed if on a regional level. Now, remember, we're still not only are we at a high regional level, we're rolling all the income cohorts into one bucket, okay? So we're rolling all owners and all renters into one bucket, all of the area into one bucket, and all of the cohorts into one bucket, okay? So, but it's still an important story. It's sort of the first piece of information you look for to see, what do I anticipate finding later? If we saw these in complete reverse, we would have a different set of expectations, okay? And we see this on the rent side too, okay? The income of your renter households is such that, they can afford a $283, and the market is fairly well marked to that at $280. Okay, at $980. Okay, so it's fairly closely together. So now we take a look at the production.
Well,
yes.
Before you move on to the next slide, how was affordability defined in your presentation?
Sure.
The reason I ask, looking through it, and I thought it was really interesting. I kind of thought about my own situation.
Yes.
And according to the presentation material, my wife and I should be able to afford a lot more than we have right now.
Yes.
But I know that we can't because there's so many other pressures on our income.
That's right.
So I was just wondering how that was taken.
So it's a great question, and in many respects, it's the central question of any attempt to craft coherent policy, right? Whether it's a fiscal policy, a monetary policy, a land use policy, a zoning policy, it's the central issue. And so another household, the best way I can seek to answer that is, if I had yours and your wife's exact finances at home with me and my wife, the same budget, okay, we might rebalance it differently. We might choose this box of cornflakes over that box of Cheerios and choose to save $2 here and spend $2 elsewhere, right? So that at a high level, that accounts for so much variability, right? So you and your wife might find 1,800 square feet of a particular configuration on a 9,000 square foot lot exactly perfect. We might find we need 2,100 square foot, but a smaller lot, right? So with thousands of variables, it becomes incredibly elastic. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is throw all that out now and go to the next piece, which is over the decades, we've developed a rule of thumb, loosely called the rule of thirds, or one could call it the rule of thirds. It basically says that your housing payment, okay, that which we call your housing payment, some folks will say it does or doesn't include utilities, but for the most part, it's paying off your mortgage and covering your taxes and covering your insurance and or paying your rent, okay? It shouldn't exceed a third of your gross monthly income, okay? Why is that, okay? So if you come to super high cost markets, the Boston market, the New York, Manhattan market, Northern New Jersey market, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Northern Virginia, those markets, high percentages of a community will pay 35, 40, 45, 42, 50% of their income for housing. In many cases, some cases because there's no other options, demand is outstripping supply. In some cases, it's by choice, okay? I will take this quality of neighborhood and school over this one, and I'll suffer the difference, and I'll have a old 16-year-old Toyota instead of a newer Mazda, right? Okay. The rule of thirds, though, is poignant because that's the moment when repayment is considered at risk by lenders and investors. It doesn't mean you and your wife are going to default on your mortgage if your mortgage payment goes to 35% or 40% or 45%. It just means the probabilities go up. And so capital doesn't tend to go where the risk is up unless it's priced accordingly. And over time, for a number of other factors, everything is level set to somewhere between 30 and 40%. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, there's one variable to think about too, which is these. So you could take any of these numbers up here and either multiply rent times 36 or take home value and divide it by 3, and you have a quick sense of what the income is you have to get to, right? If interest rates go back to where they were when I was a freshman in college, right, in their 14%, right, or construction lending is 19%, then those numbers are completely changed. This is in the post-Clinton era of stable interest rates, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 30-year mortgage match. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Okay, yes.
Have there been any considerations about pairing these programs? I think you guys did a really good job of articulating all of the complexities that you just outlined, but you also had a very focused approach on the populations that you were going after. So within, there was some first responders and target. What would be the difference between all of the complexities in what's being proposed versus doing market comp adjustments for those specific individuals?
You had me until market comp adjustments. I don't know what you mean.
Okay, so if I look at one of the things that was proposed, and jumping ahead, is that we're targeting populations as teachers, as staff members, as firefighters, as
yes.
all of those folks. Okay, so
conceivably.
But if that is a target population, yes. Has there been studies that look at building out the complexity of programs and administration to support something like this versus actually giving a market-based comp adjustment to those individuals? So firefighter makes X. If we raise the salary, you mean? Raise that salary and leave it in their hands as to what they would like to do.
There are jurisdictions that do that. Okay, I don't know that there are efficiency studies or optimization studies, which there may well be, and I'm delighted to look because it's a great question. I'd like an answer. I'm curious about the answer. But you can find jurisdictions that adjust on the demand side by giving a salary increase, and those that adjust on the supply side or some backdoor mechanism, right? As a general rule, the fewer moving parts, the easier. That doesn't mean that it passes the optics test of what a city council can run on, sell, discuss, defend in any community. But there are examples of both, absolutely. In general, but there's a common denominator though. You had said adjust and then let them go to the market and shop, right? The common denominator is on that end of the spectrum, so long as it's in our jurisdiction.
Well, but you can work that out through.
Whether it's in Seattle, Seattle City Council isn't going to boost a firefighter to be able to buy a home in Tacoma.
No, but that can be handled through contracts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's right. And many jurisdictions, very time tested to have a conditional boost on income in order to buy in our jurisdiction, and then it has certain conditions on it. Absolutely.
Let me get you back to slide 4 if I can, Charles.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So at the head of your slide, you say regional affordability, which presumably relates to slide slide 3. So what you're saying is your medians include Siler City and Roxborough and...
Everything you see on this map goes into this, right? And so, yes, you're dealing with markets here, you're dealing with mobile homes, you're dealing with 5,500 square foot mansions, the whole show, right?
Thank you.
But it's a good snapshot because if I take that same snapshot and I look at Sonoma and Napa County, those bars are completely inverted, right? So just bear that in mind, okay? So it's an entry-level photo, or, all right, so as you know, I think, and I'll check my notes someplace, the growth is astronomical. What is it, 350, where is my note? 358%, something like that is your population, your household growth the last 17 years. The county's household growth is 57%. I mean, everything's been exploding at some significant level, and as you can see here from the slide, a significant number of new renter households are here, a significant number of new owner households are here, and the production has been pretty good. The North Carolina home builders, in terms of their capacity to put stuff on the street, is pretty good. Okay, they're moving through it. They're moving, and their product is being consumed. It is more readily. The pipeline has been more robust on the ownership side than it has been on the renter side, but it's been a big pipeline. It's been coming through, a lot of product. Okay. This nonetheless has resulted in some deficits. Okay, so we do show that at different price points, you've got certain deficits, okay? And it's actually interesting, somewhat typical, that you're sort of ironically short at the top and short at, you would expect to be short at the bottom because there's no profit. It's odd that you're kind of short at the top, but that really tends to indicate that your builders have found their Goldilocks space a little shy of the very top, okay? That's where they really find their profit. And in any case, something that's very important here on the right side of this slide is that while that number 1,300 could be 1,275, could be 1,325, depending on interest rates, depending on who the asset manager is, the price of the land, the cost of equity, we would be shocked if a developer of an apartment building in this region could put a unit on the ground and charge less than $1,300 for a 2-bedroom apartment and break even. We don't see how they can do it. Okay, I'm sure there's somebody who can, but that's an important number because if you're earning $20,000, your maximum affordable rent is $550. Right, so there's a huge gap between the bare minimum of what the private sector can put on put in service, and the absolute most that a fry cook can afford to rent, right? So there's a big 800, and so very quickly you can see $800 a month times 12 months, and it's a big number, times the number of workers is a big number, right? And so then the question is, where are people living, right? We have 58,000 such households across the region with about 30,000 units priced right about for them. So there's a good 30,000 households at that $25,000 a year annual income across that region, again, across this region, who are overpaying. So they're paying, to go to your question, Mr. Sack, they're going to be paying 35, 40, 45%, okay? Or they will be paying something affordable for a substandard unit, okay? Or some combination of the two, and they're commuting, okay? It's the Fuquay-Varina strategy, right? So that's how that'll work out, okay? So yes?
So is commuting considered part of affordability as well?
Depends who you ask. Really until 96, 97, 98, not really. In the late 90s, really before we sort of took off, Fannie Mae had begun to really think through what's the impact of transportation costs. So if I've got 2 car payments, 2 insurance payments, and so I've got that second car, the second insurance payment, $400 a month. What happens if my mortgage is closer to my job, so my job's housing spatial mismatch isn't so great? I don't have 40 minutes, I've got 3 minutes. And that was really the advent of the location-efficient mortgage, recognizing that we'll actually lend you more than 30% if you're closer to a job, okay? It gets tricky when now we have nearly 100% of the households with both mom and dad working, commuting in opposite directions sometimes. Maybe somebody's going to Duke Hospital and somebody's working here in Morrisville, and they're living in between. So the number of permutations gets somewhat significant. And so it has caused some rethinking of, well, how do we think about transportation? But in general, we do think about it, absolutely. And you want to think about it. Okay? So here, just this, we're just beginning to show really this western arc, really the Cary Apex, Morrisville, western end of the county as it moves west and begins to touch the Chapel Hill market, the Orange County market. You know, you begin to really just see that's where the costs are incredible. And so we've given maybe a dozen fair share maps that I would encourage you, you know, in the next weeks or months if you're interested, really look at those distribution maps. Okay, they give you a sense of where do you have clusters of $125,000 a year households, where do you have clusters of $25,000 and less a year households. Okay, but in general, you're the switching station. You're dead center with super high owner incomes and super high renter incomes, and relative to those incomes, housing prices, both on the ownership side and the rental side, they're affordable. They're affordable for who's here, okay? And certainly for the wages that you generate here, okay? The story's, it's a nuanced story though. So what's really important to understand is if you are at under $40,000 a year, you experience the housing market in this region very, very differently than if you're above $40,000 a year. That's really a magic break point, the high 30s. So across the region, you need about 2.5 times minimum wage to participate in the housing market and not either have a prohibitive commute, prohibitive cost burden, or prohibitively low quality. Okay, all right. So one of those three things is in play if you are less than 2.5 times the minimum wage. Okay, where it gets triply complicated is if you double up, right? So you have 2 workers, you are now 2 of 2.5 of what you need. Okay, so that's a complexity you want to also think about. Okay, in Morrisville it's 3.5, and that really represents not a change in labor costs or material costs, although you know, it is and will continue to be increasingly expensive to put housing on the ground here because of your standards and your expectations, but your land costs. Your land scarcity is now a part of that. So the difference between 2.5x and 3x is land scarcity. Your land, the land in Cary and the land in Apex it's very high cost land. There's just not a lot of it, okay? So if we go not very far just into the county, your land costs can drop, you know, from $350,000 an acre to $75,000 an acre like that. Okay. So there's a lot of cheap land in Wake County. Yes.
But if I read this chart correctly, what you are really saying is pricing of current pricing of homes within the based upon today's home prices.
Yes.
For somebody to buy a house in Morrisville,
You need $100,000.
you need 100. Okay, this one it says I think 85, but okay, $100,000,
Yeah,
right?
So
And
we're dealing sometimes with 27.
I understand that's
But to answer your question, you need $100,000.
$100,000, right?
So you need 2 50s, you need a 40 and a 60, but you need to come up with 100. Setting aside credit scores, setting aside down payment,
Yep.
you need 100. Okay? That puts you in the game to buy. Okay? Is that
Yeah, and I was just rethinking about the situation of what you said on the earlier page, which was based upon the people who live here and their incomes, they can afford the prices in the area, right? It's a chicken versus egg problem, right? Because if the builders are going to say, okay, I'm going to price, if I'm going to price my rent based upon the income of the people who kind of live in Morrisville or prefer to live in Morrisville, then you kind of you are already setting up the threshold to be higher.
It's a very much an effect, cause, effect.
Yeah.
Right? So you've got a flywheel effect, right? Now, it's a little different on the rental market because the market knows that when you buy a home, you don't leave in 30 days, you don't leave in 6 months, you're in for a while, right? You're in for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, right? Generally speaking, if you cut and run inside of 7 years, you lose your money anyway, even in the best markets, okay? So they know that, right? Consequently, they have a different relationship to price, right, than the rental market. The rental market absolutely knows that I could lose my tenants tomorrow, so they actually can't afford to run their rents up. So we do make mention of the fact that your rental household incomes are so high, right, that one of the things we found so interesting here is this is one of the few markets in the United States where the median renter is earning about $80,000 a year, right? Renter household, okay? That's a lot of money, okay? Your median renter household is on par with the county's owner household for all intents and purposes, right? So you would expect rents to be much higher than they are. They're not because the multifamily owners know these guys are going to go to Chapel Hill, they're going to go to Raleigh, they'll commute before they pay so I can only soak them but so much.
Yep.
We do anticipate, though, that your rental property owners will figure out soon that they're undercharging, okay? So we expect your rents to go up, okay? So if we come down to the Morrisville market, so now sort of shifting from the region and sort of picking this place in the region, I mean, this is like Maricopa and Phoenix, in 04, 05, 06. I mean, your numbers are astounding. They're astounding numbers. I mean, I don't know how many of you as board members, we're doing plan review and approval in 04, 05, 06, but you've got to be exhausted. I mean, it's like drinking water from a fire hose. The permit rate is incredible, right? So, but something that's not here that I want to debate. I want you to think about as board members. As a general rule, monoculture is not a good idea. The Irish didn't find it was good in potatoes, and you're not going to find, and Coloradans aren't going to find it's good with silver maples. And you're not going to find it's good with housing either, right? All that stuff you put in the same day ages at the same time. It all hits the use-by date at the same time. So be thinking about that. Now, there's an opportunity there on the affordability side with master leasing, okay? So think about that as well. But just be mindful that the market that's varied is the market that's durably strong, okay? Here, I really want to draw attention to the fact that all these bars, none of these bars are behaving the way they ought to behave if you in Morrisville had an affordable housing crisis, in our view, okay? That's a truth that coincides along another truth, okay? If you are at $20,000, $25,000, $30,000, $32,000 a year, it doesn't matter that is also true. These are two truths, okay? It just means that the renters you have can afford far more than they're having to pay, massive amounts actually, and the owners you have are paying more than they can afford to pay, okay? Sometimes it's found in tuition, sometimes it's found in tuition, it's found in second cars, it's found in vacations, it's found in other places, but the cost burden isn't there, okay? If the cost burden was there, those numbers would be different, okay?
So if I take a look at this chart, right, this is only focused on Morrisville.
I'm sorry?
This chart is only focused on Morrisville.
Just Morrisville. Just Morrisville.
So the question I have is really, is Morrisville, when we say Morrisville is not facing an affordability crisis, is it because of the size of Morrisville and the commute from other places being so small that we could afford not to have affordable housing, yet people could commute from other places?
I would describe it differently. It's that you have incubated a lot of high wage jobs, right? And those jobs pay an enormous amount. And people who are earning an enormous amount are marrying somebody who's earning an enormous amount. And a high percentage of them want to live right here, right? And a large number of folks who are in the same situation but aren't here, they're working very, very close to here, right? Want to live here, right? So they're capitalized. Your two high-income wage earner households are capitalizing on the proximity of a lot of job density right here, right where you are, okay? And a very close distance outside of that space, the housing market drops off, right? So that it's readily affordable in 35 minutes. And so part one is you have high wage job density, high education density in one space. Right outside, it drops right off, the pricing, okay? And in your high density, high wage job space, you actually don't have a high percentage of low wage workers, okay? You have some, but you don't have a high percentage. Compared to Raleigh, compared to Durham, it's very, very, very different, okay? Compared to Chapel Hill, you've got, so students are dragging that market in different directions. The Durham economy is dragging it in different or pulling it. I don't want to say drag, pulling it in different directions. The Raleigh market is very different. Here, it's a cluster of concentrated, two-income, high-wage, high-education households, a small percentage of low-wage households. That small percentage of low-wage households doesn't have to commute a great distance to find good and decent housing in Wake County, okay? In other words, the county's doing you a great favor.
Yeah, but what I'm afraid of is us turning into the next San Jose, right? Where it started off being this one place where it was high density of high income and close job proximities. And as those things, kept on growing, finding a housing in San Jose became so expensive that people started expanding into Oakland and surrounding areas.
There's a limiting, yes, there is a, as all high-cost markets that are landlocked soon discover, there are limiting factors, okay? And you will, particularly as planning board members, soon confront or soon have to confront that the land limitation, right, and the self-generating economic power of such a high concentration of talented, high-wage people in one space means that you'll have to cope with density and height. Sooner or later, one way or the other, you'll have to cope with it. How you do it is up to you, but you'll have to do that. Okay? Right. Now, how you do it can include no, we won't, but you will be faced with the question.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So you can either go out, or you can go up, or you can go neither.
Yeah.
Okay? But there's just, you've burned your land, right? So that there aren't a lot of options, right? Okay. So more or less, this was at a narrative level, this was the conversation we had with city council some months ago, or with town council some months ago when we initiated the conversation. And what town council members told us was a lot about their commitments to certain target markets, for instance. Okay, so veterans were very important to town council. Teachers were very important. First responders were very important. This was something that was very much something that they were very interested in. So we responded in part. We listened carefully to that. Okay, and what we've recommended. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, but it's essentially we think that if you give consideration in three areas, you have the opportunity to bear some fruit if this turns into a priority of yours, okay? So in the first, it's a community servant housing choice program, and this pretty much is responsive, both on a homeowner and a renter level, to the town council's aspirations to be thinking about city employees, public employees, particularly first responders, teachers, okay? The second is, and I'm going to go through these in a second, the second really is more of a shaking hands with the private sector in a more direct way, right? So in the form of land purchases, in the form of master leases, and then thinking through maybe an overlay zone on density bonuses. So there are elements to both of those we can talk about. And the third is, I think, if you ask my staff, every one of us has different favorites, right? So Eric will go with the blue options all the time. Pete will go with the pink options, and I happen to like the regional housing trust fund options. Okay, so at the end of the day, the trust fund option really is to recognize that you coexist in a region. Your commuter shed is complicated. People are coming and going all the time, right? And so at a regional level, at that broad regional level, you've got a significant deficit of housing that's affordable to folks at really under 30,000, more acutely under 25,000 in annual income. Okay, and so it's a complicated enough situation with dozens upon dozens of jurisdictions that it almost wants a regional response, as opposed to a jurisdiction by jurisdiction by jurisdiction response. And so what the third option is to price a contribution to a regional fund that would, as a region, work with a handful of specific partners to, on a fairly regular basis, figure out where are we short on supply, where does it make most sense, where are the land opportunities, okay? So that's at a high level. So we'll go through them really quickly.
I suppose at some point you have pros and cons of each of these choices.
They're all pretty good. The con, at the end of the day, they're not. These aren't real market disruptors, right? The con is they just cost money.
Yeah, but as you said about the regional part, right? The two things for the regional hub.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the two things that immediately came to my mind were two things. Yes, one is now you could potentially be creating a pocket of affordable housing or manageable housing in one area that is kind of segregated from others, right? Which does not really work well in the broader picture of you want desegregation and you want more assimilation of all kinds of incomes in various places.
Right, and so at a planning level, one of the things you'll want to be thinking about, certainly, is which of these more likely gets us what level of distribution, at a spatial level, right, to our liking, right? So where's our comfort level on the dollar side? Where's our comfort level on the impact on commute side and employee retention? How, to what extent does it shake hands with economic development? And then what's the extent to which the outcome feels right to you all in terms of this final spatial outcome, okay? So each of these, you'll want to think about it in the context, right, Mr. Stack?
Yeah, are these three that you cited here, I mean, I assume they're not mutually exclusive. You have to choose one or the other.
Absolutely not. We just set them up this way because they're easier to explain, easier to understand, easier to sort of sort through. You could throw them all into a bucket and blend them and say, look, the bottom line is incomes have this much purchasing power. The housing market can only get but this low. This gap has to be closed. We can close that gap by buying land, giving land, boosting incomes, throwing some type of an award toward the developer in the form of density and height to push that cost down, right? And so that the name of the game is to shrink this. And every increment of shrinking costs us something, right? So that's how you blend all these into one quick common story. Okay. If you were to try to then take the sweater apart and pull out a thread and say, okay, well, let's take a look at this community servant thread, right? You could do down payment assistance for city employees, right? I was able to buy my first home because I'm a veteran, and so I could go to closing with, I think I went to closing with $450 or something. I had like $200 in savings after I was done, but for a VA loan, there's no way I'm getting my first house 30 years ago, right? So you could help with down payment assistance. Down payment assistance today on a $400,000 home, if you go an 80-15-5, Not many folks who are 31 years old looking to strike in their first house are walking around with a $56,000 check, right? So you could easily take a handful of employees that you don't want to lose, incent them to stay with the down payment assistance, right? And just get that back on sale, right? You could do that. You could, instead of a down payment assistance, you could actually take an equity slice out of it, right? So you could be effectively a second or third mortgage holder, right? Just in the form of equity. When they sell it, you get it back, or some type of an equity split. Jurisdictions across the country do both of those, okay? Both of those are easy. You could do the same on rent, right? You could do a rental certificate if you so chose in order to retain certain city employees. It could be, let's suppose your employees are scored on a 5-point system. You could say, if you get 5s for 3 straight years, you're eligible for this program, or whatever it is. So there's any number of criteria, but that would be what you'd want to do with the town manager, really think that through.
So by the same token, if the town is focused, let's just say, on the Morrisville public servants,
yes,
there's no reason why the private-public partnership or the trust fund couldn't help those people.
Absolutely they could. You could be paying into this fund that could circle back around to subsidize here. You could do that, sure. And in fact, that would be the more common way to do it, would be to have these discrete programs and then figure out what do I have to use at what moment in time to deal with the peculiarities of this parcel of land or this employee or what have you, right? Absolutely. Yes?
Just a quick one. So on slide 9, there's a takeaway comment around that.
This one?
Yes, we don't have not facing an affordability crisis overall. Yeah. Can you put that crisis into context? Do we have an issue? I mean, is there a problem to be solved here? Or are we, based on the numbers here, looking at something in the future, and when does that future come?
It's a judgment call question, okay? A crisis to one party is not a crisis to another. You have a numerical deficit of something between, about just under 500 units short of what ought to be a supply of homes for first-time buyers, starting out, and a supply of rental apartments for folks earning $20,000 to $25,000 a year, right? So you're about 500 units short when we marry those together, okay? Those 500 households they're meeting their housing needs. Their housing needs are being met in one of those 3 ways. They're overpaying, they're commuting, or they're securing substandard housing somewhere, okay? And so if that number weren't 500 but were 2,500 in a community of 8,800 households, now you're getting at levels that constrain your businesses from expanding. Are you at that level right now? No, okay? Do you have a significant number of folks who are commuting some significant distance to get basic shelter? Absolutely. Okay.
So then with that 500 number, do
yes.
we have any understanding around the demographics that make that up? So if we're going to look at programs that are going to target specific demographics, how much of the problem will that solve? The reason I ask the question is that, looking through this, it seems like there's a lot of administration that goes with putting any of these things into place, and a lot of tracking that goes into
yes.
doing that. What's the payoff associated with that?
Without patting myself on the back too much, that's why I like the last solution, and my staff, who I disagree with, likes the more complicated solutions. Paying into a regional fund actually treats the problem where it is, which is at the regional level. You're a regional actor. 90% of your workers actually live someplace else, okay? And you've got a significant influx of folks who come here every day, right? You are, by virtue of not having a balanced housing supply, right, fully balanced, you're contributing to what can only be described as a significant problem of congestion that's going to get worse, okay? So if you acknowledge your regional role in that tapestry, right, the third option here, the Housing Trust Fund, gives you an opportunity to say, we have a regional share of that, right? So the WAKE by itself is 380,000 households, right? Or 370 exclusive of Morrisville, 372 exclusive of Morrisville. So you have some share in that. You don't have a lion's share, but you have a share. Contributing proportionally to that actually is a pretty good policy. It also is a pretty good model to set. Because what it says to Apex and Cary, what it says to the other jurisdictions is we are contributing what is our share of this challenge. So too can you. Right? It's really good public policy. It can coincide with the other programs. It's just the cleanest, least administrative. It's math and a check. It's pretty quick.
So assuming that we have some sort of a problem. And assuming
You do.
Right.
But it's a nominal one.
Right.
Okay.
Assuming the town takes no action.
Yes.
And remembering what you said a few minutes ago, that the region is doing Morrisville a favor.
Yes.
Can you extrapolate what it's going to look like in 5 to 10 years for those 500 or so people who are paying more than they really can afford or traveling more than they should be traveling?
The number will grow, right? There's so many variables, but the number will grow and probably grow significantly. Everyone's numbers are going to grow. Your region is, you are to some extent a exaggeration of the region, which is to say, your region is really good at the top and you're bottom heavy, and you're not so great in the middle, and you happen to be super top heavy. And you've got some bottom heaviness, but you really don't have a middle, right? The long-term durability of any economy is a lot of middle. That's where a town manager is consistently operating in red, consistently having a general fund. Revenues are outpacing inflation by some measure.
Yeah, taking back to your numbers part, right?
Yeah.
If we keep the growth patterns that we are currently seeing, and if we use those same growth patterns as a measure, use the same growth patterns that we currently have, right, as a measure of predicting what might be in the future, how long do you think it will take before we could say it will be a affordability crisis in Morrisville? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
Honestly,
I'm asking for a thumb rule projection as opposed to a hard projection.
There's no press, no media. Good. So the short answer is I don't know. But a way I would go about it is I would ask myself, how many acres are remaining? We did the analysis. I just don't have it in my notes right here. How many acres of development remain? What volume of entitlements remain? Mm-hmm. What's my job generation annual expectations, right? So how many jobs am I creating and locating here in Morrisville versus how much land is here? And on the same ratios, how quickly will I consume that, right? And then what would I expect to be the resulting price escalators, right? So how does that, you don't have a lot of land left. Maybe I'll answer it in a different way. It will border on questionable judgment on my part to say this. The time to have asked this question was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. You're asking the right question 2 decades too late. Okay? So in an important way, what you don't want to do is have somebody in your seat ask this same question 20 years from now. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep, understand.
Okay. Land here will always grow in value. You're sitting on an ATM machine. You spent 25 years making it, right? It's kicking out an increment. Use it. You could do great things with it. It's kicking out 20s all day long. It's just spitting them out. What do you want to do with it? Right?
Yep.
I'm going to jump in here if I may, Charles.
That's it for the slides, unless you want to go through specifics.
Well, let me go back to Courtney, if I may.
Sure.
Help us decide what our expectation, or what your expectation should be of this evening.
Ask as many questions as you like,
right,
so that you can get additional information. You have a couple of different options of the board. So if you do not have all your answers tonight, you can table the item and staff can bring back answers. If you do that, that is fine. Just know that I will no longer be probably participating in the process if we do that. If you have questions that wouldn't necessarily change your recommendation this evening, but you're kind of curious, we can get those and still bring those back to you, and you can still make your recommendation. It's really what you have. If you have enough information to make a recommendation, you can do that. Again, your recommendation can be denial, your recommendation can be approval, your recommendation can be, we think this is great, but we don't want to include these particular recommendations that are outlined in here. You can do that as well. So the options are kind of limitless in this one, since it's an element of a comprehensive plan as to what you would like to do. Timeline-wise, it was tentatively scheduled for the consultant to come back and present this at the, let me give the exact, the October 22nd meeting. I know the consultant's not available in November. With our schedules in December, it would probably be January before this would probably make it to council. So there would be a fairly significant delay in the project timeline. Certainly not the end of the world, but then you start to affect our next budget season. So one of the big goals here is that you have, this is a policy document. It's not a funding document. There's no fiscal constraints to this document. So if the board is supportive of the concepts in here, it's ultimately up to council as to whether or not those concepts are funded. And so it really moves into retreat, which usually happens at the very beginning of the year. So if this is not then kind of ready to go and adopted before this this calendar year ends, it most likely will not be pulled into retreat and can potentially start impacting the budget. And you would put any efforts, if you so desire to make efforts to reducing some of the affordable housing challenges here in Morrisville, off another year. So let's kind of round that back up. If there's nothing earth-shattering that would stop you from making a recommendation, but you would really like more information brought back, I'd recommend a recommendation tonight, and we can bring back additional information if you think that information wouldn't have changed what your recommendation would be. But you certainly have a right to table and seek more information as well. So,
thank you, Courtney. So I think it would be nice if we were able to make a recommendation, and this would be going to council for the 21st of October, and we might even have a guest appearance by a then former planning director.
That is correct. I will make a guest appearance on the 22nd. I have verbally committed to that. So.
We appreciate that. So what we could do is select one of these three options, Charles, or we could say we like two of these three options, or we like all three, or we like some combination. That would be a possibility, right?
It would. Here's, to bridge off of what Courtney was saying in terms of the binding nature of this, the non-binding nature of this, the extent to which your council makes decisions, budgetary decisions. I think the document does a absolutely high fidelity job of articulating a challenge that you've got and a challenge that you've got in a region that has a challenge, number one. Two, it absolutely gives a high fidelity assertion that you have a challenge. It's not a crisis, but it is a real challenge, and it's going to become more acute over time. And the shrinking volume of land and the nature of your economy means anything you do tomorrow will be more expensive than today, no matter what it is. And then finally, it gives you a template of options to use, none of which are mutually exclusive of the others, that they can be blended. Consequently, I would recommend not cherry-picking any at this time, but simply saying we like them all as options, because none of them cuts off any avenue a future board or a future council may wish to use. And they all have a very permeable membrane that you can add to and take away from as you see. You can customize infinitely, right? So there's the articulation of the challenge. It's grounded in market reality, and then you've got some responses that don't handcuff you at all, but give you a tremendous amount of freedom and give your council a tremendous amount of freedom going in the future.
Okay, thank you. So if I take that right down to the basics, then we have to agree there is a problem.
Yes.
and then we have to make some sort of recommendation to council. And I always like to make as definite, as specific as possible recommendation to council, because that's kind of what they expect of the Planning and Zoning Board, to provide some recommendation and advice. So I think it's a little bit of a cop-out to say, yeah, we like all three. So I think we ought to have some discussion on the latter. That is, among the three options. But we've had a lot of discussion this evening about, do we have a problem? And we go back to your slide 9. And to me, that just represents a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like we're in Morrisville, which is a deluxe cruising ship, and we're all fine, and we can all afford to live where we're living, and we're not thinking about the other folks. The problem to me is that practically none of our staff can afford to live in Morrisville. Many of our teachers can't afford to live in Morrisville.
Yep.
And that's the problem. It's not, with respect, it's not on your chart. It's, the problem is elsewhere. It's not on this chart. So that's where I think we've had a lot of discussion. I'm struggling with, we're a planning and zoning board, so to what extent should we advocate, for example, sort of market compensation, I think you called it, or an allowance to staff members here, for example, for them to live in Morrisville. Now, is that a planning and zoning board thing, or is that more of a...
If I may, as you know, a comprehensive plan is a non-binding document. It's like the Declaration of Independence. It says this is who we are, this is what we think is important. You implement it with a constitution. You implement it with your development code, your regulatory code, okay? And so this document, or some version of this, but the document we have before you as a amendment or an appendix to your comp plan would be read as an assertion that that housing affordability is important. It's in our DNA, right? We are paying attention to this. We pay attention to housing costs. We pay attention to commutes, our impact on everyone around us. It binds us to do nothing, but it is our declaration. It is one of the things we believe in, okay? That's how I would read this.
But you can make that declaration without subscribing to specific initiatives, right? So, I think we do need a little bit more clarity around some of them. The last one that you discussed around the regional housing fund, can you talk through some of the mechanics
Sure.
of that and how that works?
Sure, but bear in mind, if this document appears as an appendage to your comp plan, right, whatever mechanics are in here bind you to nothing on the implementation side. It simply asserts that this is a possible, these are things we considered. Having said that, yeah, the mechanics that we would see on a regional fund would be figuring out what's your share of households who are cost burdened, right? What is that number relative to the region, right? So Raleigh would have a share, you would have a share, Apex would have a share, everybody would have a share, and it would be translated into some dollar amount. So it might be an increment multiplied times 10,000 or times 50,000 or times 100,000, and then each of those jurisdictions would pay into a fund. That fund could theoretically be used for soft equity. It could be used for debt financing. Chapel Hill had some innovations, for instance, on master leasing. So they might be able to go to a fund to tap into some of those funds to do master leasing like they did in Glen Lennox, things of that nature.
What's the timing of setting that up? So right now you've articulated the 500 number, but as that number increases, is that management of the fund? When does that begin to pay off? How can you take action on that? How long does that process take?
It would. My own experience with setting up funds is it's a multi-year process to set them up, get them running, establish the intra and multi-jurisdictional agreements. You might find the situation where 60% of the jurisdictions in Wake County are for it, and 20% in Durham County are for it, and I couldn't comment on the viability.
But tangible benefits for people in Morrisville would be years out.
Yes, presumably, sure, yeah.
Because currently there does not exist a fund that we could participate in.
That's correct. What you would be doing is you'd be saying, if such a fund were to exist, we'd be a party interested in participating in that.
Could we go through the other two options? Because
Sure.
to me, the value realization of going into a fund, if it is years out.
Everything's years out.
Yeah.
Just real estate takes a long time.
No, I get it.
It takes a long time. So getting dirt, cleaning the dirt up, putting something in there, it takes a long time. Nothing happens quickly in real estate, ever. So whether it's a trust fund, whether it's shared equity program, everything is years out. That's just the way it is.
Let's just go through those two options.
Sure. So we went through the community service program fundamentally, okay? So it's either a rent subsidy or something on the home ownership subsidy. If it's a home ownership subsidy, it'll be in the form of a second, a third, or some form of equity functioning as a conditional grant that's probably soft. And in all cases, there'd be a repayment, okay? So you'd be in a position to say, when you sell, we get X back. So it's some variation of a deed restriction, okay? Common, used in many jurisdictions with great success. Very easy, and actually, this one isn't difficult to actually implement. It's not too difficult. So if we look at a sort of a partnerships toolkit, what we called, you've got in this case, master leases is the first one, land purchases are the second, and density bonuses are the third. So you may wish, working in reverse order, to have an affordable housing overlay district, a district where you give higher densities, greater densities to developers who will have some inclusionary affordable units. That's an option, okay? Generally speaking, developers not going to want to give you any affordable units, okay, unless they can find cash to pay for those units someplace. They will obtain that cash by getting more market rate units onto the same square footage of land. All right, so maybe your zoning says you can go to 3 stories. You will say, I'll tell you what, I'll let you go to 5 stories if you'll give me some affordable inclusion. Okay, so that would be how you would handle the density bonus side of it. Okay, it's a very common tool, very successful, can be tricky and complicated to manage, but it works fairly well. Land purchases are something else we'd consider, which is the town could simply purchase land and hold it in inventory. It could purchase it, knowing it's like purchasing Apple stock, and turn around and sell it and make some money, and then apply the difference to an affordable housing program. It could take the land and convey it to a developer at 0 or reduced cost. So if we go back to this slide, the name of the game is how do we get that $1,300 per unit down to 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, okay? So density is one way to get it down. Also, a land conveyance is another way to get it down. But you don't have a lot of land, right? You do have some, but not a lot, okay? So you need to expect to spend $350,000 to $550,000 an acre. Every time you get one of those, you could put an RFP on that land and say, we're looking for developers to come do something here.
What have you seen in the long term around risks around that strategy? So market downturns, some of us remember the interest rates flip,
Yeah,
what goes there? It's
a risk, but in the long run, it's okay. So it's your risk would look like this. It would be this, and then here's your risk. You have to ride it out. It's a blue chip stock. Your land is a blue chip stock, right? I like that option personally. You just buy it, right? So when somebody comes along and wants to do something, or you feel an acute pressure, you titrate it out. It's a really good option. No jurisdiction I know of, none of the high-cost jurisdictions we've worked with, Boulder, Seattle, Stamford, Connecticut, Ann Arbor, regrets land that they purchase. None.
But those are larger jurisdictions with larger volumes of land available.
Proportionally, not necessarily. They're bigger jurisdictions and they have larger land, but proportionally, you're a small jurisdiction with small amounts of land. The name of the game is get the land.
But how do you make your offer to the landowners attractive enough for them to be interested in selling?
You make an offer, and if they don't take it, say, okay, I'm not going to buy it. It's just a straight land buy.
Okay.
Whatever it is, it's going to become more valuable tomorrow. You don't care. And then on master leases give you sort of two opportunities. One is if you've got a new product coming online, you could advance lease a handful of those units, right? You're going to have to be well out in the early stages of a deal for that to be appealing to a developer who's already counting on a certain vacancy rate, a certain amount of cash coming in, a certain amount of profit. However, you have a number of multifamily units that are aging, okay? And they're going to go to second and third generation owners in the next 2, 5, 10, 12 years, being in a position to come in there as they're shifting ownership and as their vacancy rates move from 3 to 5 to 8%, okay, and their capacity to refinance changes, if you were to come in and take a small percentage of those and pay the increment between 30% and the rents that they need, they're happy to have the rents taken care of. The building continues to perform. They might be able to refinance at great terms and upgrade the building, and you get 2 or 3 units here and there. It's pretty easy, okay? And you don't have to go any further than Chapel Hill to find a really nice program in Glen Lennox. So they did a really nice job there. Very innovative. So those are those options.
So for those...
And that's it. Those are your options.
So for the master lease, I guess that's something we can run our own, right?
Sure.
In other words,
Yeah.
it's just like buying another asset for the town.
Just like what?
Just like buying another asset for the town,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We lease a bus, right? Or we lease a car or something like that. Right?
Let's say Courtney, you find out that Courtney Tanner was leaving because of housing costs, not for other reasons, right? Housing costs. And you're like, we can't lose this planner. And you sit down with her and she says, I can't afford to stay here. And you're like, we can't lose this planner. If you've got 14 or 15 units that you've master leased across 5 or 6 different apartment buildings, right? You've got something that you can offer in your negotiations with her.
Yep.
If you've got if she's renting but she wants to buy a home and it turns out I'm leaving so I could buy my first home, you're in a position to say, well, wait a second, we have this fabulous down payment program. And then you've got a 5-star planner who stays 5 more years. And then when she leaves anyway, you get some portion of the sales proceeds, so you're whole.
Yep.
You're just banking on it for a while, just sticking it in a bank.
Yep.
So all these options are good, and none of them cut off the other options. I think Mr. Sack asked a good question. Which one do any of these foreclose on the other? They don't.
I've got a
Sure.
few questions, and some of them might be more geared towards staff than to you. And if they are, I apologize.
No.
I'll ask the one that I think is more geared towards you, and then I'll get to the others. But I would assume that in any town like Morrisville, the drivers of the economy are the higher educated, higher income people. They're buying more expensive homes, more expensive cars, shopping at more expensive grocery stores, thereby paying more taxes. Fair assumption?
Yes, think of it as tug of war, right? On one side, I've got a handful of households at $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, right? And they generally are one person, one worker per household. At the other side, I've got Lenovo employees, right, just with a lot of pull weight. And that flag in the middle of the road is the median house price. And it keeps pulling in your way. And the only way I can stay in the game is to overpay for my housing or commute. That's exactly what's happening, right? So what Aspen does, and what many high markets do, is they say to a Lenovo, we really badly want you here, okay? But you're going to pay an impact fee because you're going to fill all my roads in and out of Aspen with folks who can't afford to be here, right? And I need to offset those costs. So for every employee, we're going to have, so Pitkin and Eagle County have a job generator. Every time that you build a house that's larger than 5,000 square feet, and every time you hire somebody who's paid more than $100,000, you got to pay into the box. That's how it works.
Are you able to determine maybe on a per capita basis or some other way what public servants, first responders, veterans contribute to an economy like Morrisville as opposed to the higher income Lenovo, SAS employees, things like that?
I don't have a ready answer for you. There are lots of studies on the multipliers and how much money courses through in what ways and how it goes. I wish I did.
Okay. And these questions, they might not be more for you, but do we know the average annual salary of public servants full-time in Morrisville?
I'm sure the town manager knows.
Yeah,
I don't know off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
we could provide the information for the town. What we don't have access to is any other public servant that may live in Morrisville. So easy to capture those who work for the town, may or may not include those that live here, but not easy to capture the other part.
And you kind of led into my next question, which is if we know how many Morrisville public servants live outside of Morrisville.
Anecdotally, I mean, most. But I will say, I do want to caveat that. That's for a variety of different reasons. Some may have a spouse that requires them to live within a radius of their job, which prohibits them from living here. You have others who may even fall within this income bracket that prefer larger lots, like to hunt, like to fish. That's going to automatically drive them outside of Wake County because that just generally doesn't exist. So there's lifestyle components that come with that. If you ask everybody where they live, there's a bazillion reasons why they don't live in Morrisville. People are because they like the schools that their kids go to. So it's not necessarily a reason why they're not living in Morrisville other than a very personal reason.
Right. And so you don't really know for those people, the majority who are living outside of Morrisville, that even if these programs were implemented, that they wouldn't necessarily take advantage of them by moving here.
They may. So I would say if you look at most staff in the planning department, very few actually even own a home. And the ones don't own a home, there's for a variety of reasons, but a lot of them say it's too expensive. I mean, they cannot afford a down payment. So if you had a program that allowed them to have down payment assistance, while they may prefer currently living in their downtown location, they may relocate because that's their only option to potentially enter into a home buying market, live here several years. Now they may sell, but it's allowed them to officially enter the market. Town would recoup their money and, move to a different house or so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, they are not establishing roots. I mean, they are looking at, I know I have staff that have looked at the programs that City of Raleigh offers. And looking at other home buying opportunities outside, because there are none that exist here.
The last question I have, and I think it's for you, Courtney, is there's a chart in the materials you provided to us. I don't think are included in the charts that Charles provided. It was on page 8, I think, of the materials you provided, and it was breaking down employment by industry. And I was just wondering where we find the majority of Morrisville public servants in those categories.
I know
And I have it here. I can show it to you.
I can pull it right up. It's actually in the plan itself.
Those are regional numbers, I believe, right there.
Yeah, is that it?
I think we had region, and then we pulled in, we also had,
I think it was included in regional and
it
Morrisville.
had both, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. There you go. Is that the chart you were referring to, Mr. Sack?
Yes.
Okay. Let me blow it up then so we can all actually read.
So my question is really where the Morrisville public servants fall in these categories.
Yeah, you can probably answer it better than I can.
If you look to the far right, you'll see the admin column. That's what they'll be. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Let's conclude your questions, Kenneth.
That's it, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, just a couple of follow-ups on the implementation. So I would assume that if a program like this went into place, we'd have more demand than supply initially for housing, right? So if we're going on the assumption that we're under 500 units, we wouldn't on day one of implementation have 500 units available. So a couple of questions. How do we navigate selection? I'm sure there's an application process. How do you navigate that? And then deal with concerns around not bias in selection? And then the second part of that question is, how do you monitor, if economic status is the driver, how do you monitor that year to year for changes in household income?
Right. So there are reporting requirements if you tailor a program for something like that. That absolutely happens. Some cities use a lottery system. Some cities have literally it's a first in line system, and it goes until the money, there's an annual allocation, and it goes until it's gone. Both are commonly used. It also is one of the reasons you could also just very tailor. You could theoretically trump that issue by simply tailoring it to first responders. You could have a trial run with a small group, right? See how it works. Expand it then to teachers. You could start with teachers and then go to first responders. That would be a good way to do it. But you get around that entirely. Those difficulties and those challenges on a land route, on a density route, or on a trust fund route.
Yep.
Those are excellent questions.
Chris, any questions?
No. I do think the prioritization of the services would be important to me, of the specific roles. We've talked teachers and we've talked first responders and fire. I think that would be important, if not just their job performance, but location of the roles and the criteria of those roles. I don't think that's for us to decide, but that would be something that I would think the city would need to really vet.
One of the reasons that you don't find the specifics here is that we weren't writing the regulatory side of things. We were writing the Declaration of Independence side, the comp plan side. It's general, right? And I think there is actual language in here which is for staff and electeds and appointeds to figure out the program mechanics at the right time. That's so recognize this is written at a comp plan level.
Any more questions?
Just looking at this chart, we are perhaps looking at about 30% of employees, and I'm just speculating here based upon just the industries they are in, that could use affordable housing in the area, right? Because public is 2.8, education is about 15, retail, warehouse, some of those, if I count, we are close to about 25% of employees that might need some kind of assistance. Is that how I can read this chart?
You could end up with a number that's sizable, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look at the program, it's not just the 500 units that we so get focused on. We need to look at how we can make housing affordable for these 25% of the people who commute whole lot, and to me, time is value. If they are close by, they can also be, contributing to the society in terms of productivity, as well as, being in the community and paying taxes and all the associated benefits you get by them being in the community as opposed to commuting from other place. Right?
Right, but I would give yourselves some maneuvering room here, as Mr. Pritchard said earlier, which is first, we recognize that we've got a challenge. Second, we recognize it's a challenge we want to do something about. Third, we agree we're going to do something about. And the something could look like some of the things here, right? That precedes the weeds of, that's the what. The how is the mechanics of it later.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, walk before you run. You don't have to think about 500. You just think about some, right? How do we keep the planning director from moving? Where are you moving?
Wake Forest.
How do we keep the planning director from moving to Wake Forest, right? What's that cost? That's it. That's, so you take the comp plan level at the high level, you work through, it's an issue, right? We acknowledge it, we want to do something about it, these are the things we might do. Now, then we go into the next phase, which is, oh no, you can't leave, let me show you this program, right?
So I have some comments. At our August 27th joint meeting with the council, a couple of the council members said, the devil is in the details. And I think if we look at any of these potential programs, there's enough administrative stuff there to scare me to death. I know, how on earth would you administer that? How would you do this? How would you do that? But that's not a reason to shy away from doing something. And for me, the starting point that seems to be the simplest and would answer a need is for us to somehow help the Morrisville staff to stay in Morrisville, to offer some incentives. They don't have to live in Morrisville, but offer them some incentives so that more of them are able to. So that, to me, would be a great starting point, and you can kind of expand from there.
It's great.
I'm a little bit skeptical of, and I'm sorry that you're the one who advocates this, the regional housing trust fund, because your region is so huge. It goes Siler City to Princeton to Roxborough. I mean, it's just enormous. I don't think it helps Morrisville to help even more people who have a job in Morrisville to kind of live in Siler City or Arnett County or a long way away. So I'm a little bit worried about that particular proposal. It's bad enough what happens today. I'm sure that many of the folks who don't earn a lot of money but service the hotels in Morrisville are definitely not able to live in Morrisville. And they're being forced further and further out. So maybe that's a reason why we would support something regional. But your choice of region, understandable though it was, because you took the two MSAs, it is so huge, it's so outside the triangle that leads to some problems. So that said, I would like us, it's coming up to 8 o'clock, I would like us to make some sort of recommendation to the council. The first question I have is, do we as a group think that there is a problem? And I'll look for a nodding of heads. But what do you think, Tim?
So I'm not convinced based on the numbers that we have a problem today. I think that there may be one in the future, but that future may not be now. I think also that the approach that's laid out is trying to go very much into detail where there could be a simpler solution to solving the problem. And I think overlooking that or not courageously pursuing that is a mistake. Because if we're really trying to look at some of key stakeholders within the community and address it, be that our firefighters, our police, our staff, our first responders, then we should take action directly and specifically to help them. I don't think that we need government programs that will then tie their hands and really limit what they do with their economic wherewithal. I would much rather have that directly in their hands and would try to advocate for the council to look at opportunities to raise that. I'd be much, much in favor of that and cut out the additional administration completely from this process. So if there was a issue, I think it needs to be much more focused. I actually disagree. I think you need to go into the details first and find out exactly what you're trying to solve for and then build out. It's good to have a high strategy plan, but without the actually implementation of it, I worry that it would go into everywhere all the times, and these things never really unravel. So that's my concern.
Great.
I think it's a little bit of a solution in search of a problem, but I'll concede that there does seem to be at least a little bit of a problem at this point. But as Charles said, it will become a bigger problem. And so I think it's good to get out in front of it now and look at solutions that we can try to implement. I would like a little bit more detail about all three of them. Personally, I've always been in favor of public-private partnerships. I think those two entities working together bring out the best of each other and, help the economies of scale and, innovation from the private sector and close detail to budgetary considerations from both sides. For me, I would be leaning towards that direction, but wouldn't foreclose either of the other two. I just think I need a little bit more information at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Kenneth. Chris.
I believe it's worth pursuing. I would lean towards service, critical service, fire, police that need proximity. So to me, those are very important services. And so I look what's really affordable for them to be close to their job. And I also liked option 3 as well as some more investigation. But I do agree that there is enough interest in the topic that it should be pursued, and the council can decide what those next steps are. But I think as zoning, either we should support some option for them.
Thank you, Chris. Sanjay.
I would say we may not. I'll step back. We do have a problem for a certain segment of our society. Even though the numbers may say that they can still commute. Commute is not that bad in our area so far, but it's getting worse. I certainly believe that time is value, and therefore we need to look into programs where the commutes and people can stay and work in proximity, right? That said, I'm also not a proponent of government doing heavy lifting for a lot of people, right? So, and governments are notoriously slow in doing anything. So I'm definitely not in favor of option 3, where we have to do we have to spend a lot of time to get any result back from it. So option 1 and option 2 are things that are within our control in some sense. So to Tim's point, if we prioritize, and to Chris's point, if we prioritize something for the town employees that we need to do something about, those programs can definitely be acted upon sooner than later as part of their compensation plan that town needs to work on, right? In terms of people who are not town employees, like retail workers, restaurant workers that we need to have closer to their workplace, those are certainly things that as planning and zoning board members, we need to really work with the private sector builders in figuring out what are the ways that they can make affordability part of their commitment to building something in the town. So I certainly look at option 1 being something that the town should pursue for the town employees, and option 2 is something that we as board members should look at how we leverage our relationship with our builders in approving their plans or whatever to incorporate affordable housing within their plans. I mean, that's something that comes to my mind. Sorry.
The only thing that I would like to see is actually a comparison, right? So I would like to define the actual number of the problem as it exists today. So if we have target markets and we look at where is the delta between housing, we can find that number today if we go after that market. I'd like to know what that is. And then I would also like to say, if we were going to enact something as you would a comp schedule over the course of 10 years with rates, what does that cost you versus buying a parcel of land over that's going to cost you X amount of dollars. And just do that comparison, because I think before you go down the road of having programs that will require administrations, and look at those fully loaded. So, take a look at what the programs that we're suggesting here. What are the complications? What are the costs? What are all of the administration burden holistically versus the population that we have now? And if you did a comp adjustment in the market and got them tomorrow to where they could be, can you solve it quicker? Is that even an opportunity to do that? And maybe there's things around that we don't know or haven't thought through, but I think just to have that factual delta data point would be helpful for us.
I agree. That's why I was asking earlier about a projection of when does this problem that is not critical today becomes critical, right? And given the pace at which governments work, we need to at least start considering these plans now as opposed to later. Now, I do agree with you that details need to be worked out and need to be examined we need to scrutinize them even harder so that we can figure out where to invest what, right? But at the very least, we need to have a plan to go and study some of these things, let's say in the next 6 months, right? If not sooner.
And that typically would be the next step. So you come up with the plan, and here are your options. And the next step is, okay, if we were to fund options, you can start, that's when you bring a consultant back on to say, okay, what are the starting costs associated with that? If we were to only do one, and how do you compare? And then you can prepare kind of the next line of how much you would invest in that. And then when could you start, getting a rate of return? If you put this much now, does it take X years if we go into a housing trust fund? Or if we put this much now, we could start year X of actually, say, funding a down payment program. So, there's different ways you can start looking at that, but that's the next step. This is really, if we were, problem today, problem tomorrow, if we were to solve, here are the options that could work for Morrisville. They're all legal within the state of North Carolina. And then you'd go to the next step and saying, okay, we do want to put X money towards this. What option could be potentially viable now? It's actually another step within the process of moving forward. You may find once you find out those numbers that some of them aren't going to yield what you want. So the cost of the program and implementing the program and all the things that, Tim is talking about. There's some administration cost that may not be the best route for us to go. There may be another. They're doing something very similar. So, for example, in the transportation plan, public transit was a thing in there. That was clear. So you have the comp plan that says public transit, you need to take a look at that. Now we have a public transit study that looked at different modes and now has developed cost of the different modes and now has a recommendation of which one to move forward with. It's kind of step B. You would probably have a step B associated with this. So then you're not just saying, hey, let's pick this one because that one sounds great. You would get another layer of details and some cost and things that would go into it as well. So there is a next phase where more decisions could be more fine-tuned and made. These are just legal options within the state of North Carolina that would work in a jurisdiction of our size that would solve the problems identified in the plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does, right? And like Tim was saying, we definitely need to get into the details at some point.
And what I think I'm probably hearing is from most of you, not all of you, that there's either a problem now or there could be a problem in the future. So if you're going to do it, you're favoring towards, some type of community servant. So you can recommend approval of a plan and say, but, our preference is that the council focuses funding on helping community servants. You can make that in your recommendation, and that's also guidance to council, but you're still keeping a potpourri of options available.
That's exactly where I was headed, and the slide in front of us is very appropriate, I think. So do I get a nodding of heads that there is either a problem or a potential problem, at least?
Potential problem, yes.
I think we're all agreed on that.
Yes.
So okay, we have a problem, so that's good. Good move forward. So now, looking at this chart in front of us, what's our feeling? Do we want to help the guys in blue, pink, or brown, or all of the above? I'll jump in and say I think a great starting point would be that blue sector, the challenge to address the public sector employees.
I would go blue, brown, then pink. I've prioritized for you.
Colors are always so good.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, right, my recommendation would be that blue is perhaps the easiest way to get started, but I would choose pink because that's a lot of it is something within our control. It is something we can exercise more rapidly. I don't like the brown simply because there will be, number one, to get that going will be a long run. Number two, there will be way too many players that we'll have to haggle with, do some horse trading with. And that's really one reason. And to what Tim said earlier is that seems to be a big pool for doing something way outside of Morrisville, especially if you take into account all of Wake County, right? I would, had it been just a Cary Morrisville kind of a pool, maybe a different situation. But if you are looking for a pool that is so broad, I don't foresee it being quite productive and materialistically useful for Morrisville.
Okay. Tim?
Still not comfortable with the three options that are provided until we have a proof of concept that compares a specific case with what it would take to do a adjustment. And again, I understand that we may not have the wherewithal to do a market adjustment that may be outside of what a town does as opposed to what a company does. But I think the value of having that information it would be helpful, and then and only then kind of work to a pilot.
Okay. Thank you. Kenneth?
I think the council has expressed its desire to kind of help our community servants. And so I think the blue option is a good way to start and see how much success we have from that. And it might alleviate the problem to the extent that maybe it, makes the low income affordability less the problem than it is today. But then, I like the pink option as a way of something more long-term. I just like the idea of the private sector working with government to try to get things done. It makes everybody a stakeholder. And I think on a long term, both of them can work long term. I just don't know enough about the Regional Housing Trust Fund to be comfortable recommending that.
Thank you, Kenneth. So would we be comfortable as a board making a motion that includes, I think, an appreciation for the work that Charles and his team has done, and that we think if there isn't a problem today, it's certainly one that's going to happen soon, and that we would recommend moving forward and exploring some of these a bit more and getting some of the data that I think would make Tim feel more comfortable, and then we'd be in a better position to compare things. Is that kind of a reasonable? It's a little bit fuzzy, but at least it's a way forward. And I can envision, Tim, you being a key member of perhaps a special task force with members of the council trying to, go through these. I think your analytical, administrative perspective would be really valuable in taking us a step further. So if somebody can make a motion, including you, Chris, because you're now a voting and a potential motion-making member.
I'm not clear on the motion. I'd like to defer.
So it's not.
Ken, you want to make one? You want to make one, or Ken wants to make one?
I'm trying to think of how we want to phrase it. So maybe we can articulate the ask. Are we looking at an ask for additional information as a comparator before
No, I
pursuing?
think we're looking for, and feel free to disagree with me, but I think what we need is a fuzzy recommendation that we move forward and that all of these need more study.
If I can summarize, what I'm hearing, I don't think everybody agrees, I will say that, on the direction, but most of you agree that you could recommend approval of the plan. However, you want to emphasize that really the focus should start on figuring out how to address serving our community servants, with a strong desire to recognize that there's merits to the other, but they're just not the number one preference of the choices listed above when it comes to prioritization, when council starts looking at funding and further evaluating, et cetera. There seems to be a desire for the blue. Would that be correct?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because everybody had different priorities. When I started listening, I would go blue to pink, or I'd go blue to brown to pink. So everybody's a little bit different, but blue, with one exception, was kind of towards the top. We have one, I want more information before I could make any type of positive recommendation. And the rest were, we could make the recommendation, not saying there's a problem now, but there could be a problem in the future, some now, some future. But any funding prioritization should go towards the community servant category down the road.
So how about I try something out and
Please.
You say agree or not agree? Okay. Do we have to say something before we recommend? Typically we have a big verbiage before that. Okay. I make a motion to acknowledge the consultant who has done the work on the affordable housing project. We recognize that though there is not a current affordable housing crisis in Morrisville, but there is one we anticipate coming on us relatively soon. And therefore, we also acknowledge that housing for community servant is a issue in Morrisville, and therefore we recommend the town council to begin the working the details or examining the details of the community servant housing choice program, and at the same time explore potential partnership toolkits as a long-term position for affordable housing. We also look at potential. We also recommend perhaps setting up a working committee or working team to examine the numbers in greater details and figuring out a plan to execute the affordable housing action in Morrisville.
That's a long motion. But thank you.
I had to cover all the points.
Thank you very much. So if I can summarize, I think your 4 points are, the nicety, but it's genuine too. They acknowledge the work that's been done by the consultant. That we as a board recognize that if we don't think there's a problem now, it's certainly one that will happen. And I think we're going to recommend that council adopts the plans as outlined here with a starting point priority on the community servant housing choice program.
That's good.
And suggest that the council sets up a working group to delve into more details of each of these.
Right.
Is that a reasonable summary? Did you get some of that, Marty?
You have to try one more time.
Say, Marty, read that back to us. Well, let me give you the bullet points again, and feel free, anybody, to criticize. So the first point is that we acknowledge the work that's been done by the consultants. And the second point is that as a board, we recognize that there may not be an affordable housing problem at the moment, but there's certainly one that will appear soon. And that we recommend that Council adopts the actions outlined in this report with the priority on establishing a community servant housing choice program, and recommends that the Council consider setting up a working group, including some very keen members of the Planning and Zoning Board, to look into further details and implementation. Is that reasonable? Well, that was your motion.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, Marty, you have most of that. Thank you. So do I have a second for that motion?
Second.
Any discussion of the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. So it's passed with one nay. Thank you, Charles. Thanks for enduring
having me.
our
Thank you.
questions. So it's a little while after 8, and I think our next move is to have a working session. Courtney? I can find my
That's
agenda.
correct. If we could just take a quick recess so we can convene
Yeah.
down.
I think that would be a great idea. So we'll reconvene in 10 minutes' time.
Yeah.
Down